So this month I read a total of 9-ish books, depending on how you want to count. We had a nice mix of some fantasy, some classics, some literary fiction, some short stories, just a variety of genres, variety of stuff. First book I read this month was Tress in the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is a fantasy story. It takes place in his wider series universe called The Cosmere, and in this story we follow a girl named Tress. We start off with the story, she's living on an island. She's pretty content with her life. She's described as just a normal girl, but the special thing about this world is that all the oceans are not made of water, they're made of these magical things called spores. And there's lots of different types of spores, and they all have magical things that happen when they interact with water. And so that plays a huge role in the story. For example, Tress's island is in a sea of spores that when they interact with water, they grow into these huge vines that are really dangerous. And so that's kind of the backdrop and the main world building thing for the story. And we see Tress having to leave her island to go on an adventure. Overall, I enjoyed it a lot. It wasn't my favorite Brandon Sanderson, but there was a lot of good elements to it. The world building, I would say, some of the best he's ever done. Also the storytelling, it's a very fairy tale-like story. The descriptions of the world are very beautiful, and just in general, it's a very creative backdrop for a story. And also the voice that the story is written from, the perspective is from the narrator himself, and the narrator has kind of a role in the story as well. And that was a very interesting choice. And also wider Cosmere connections did happen in the story that I think were done pretty well. Overall though, I think the plot was pretty generic. There was nothing really special about it, at least to me. I think there was lots of creative elements, but it just wasn't my favorite thing ever, but I still gave it 3.5 stars in the end. So I still enjoyed it, just not as much as some people, but yeah. Next up, I read Bartleby by Herman Melville. I had to read this for school. So this is a short story. It's a classic, and this man named Bartleby is starting at an office, and we follow an unnamed narrator who is his boss at the office as he comes in. There's this famous line from the book, "I would prefer not to," and that's kind of the basis of the whole book. He doesn't conform to the office. He doesn't conform to society standards. I don't have a lot to say about it. It's kind of acts as a critique of capitalism, of the modern workplace. I mean, this was written during Industrial Revolution, so lots of things were changed. It's very depressing, I will say that, but overall, not gonna rate it. I just don't have a lot of thoughts on it, but it was very interesting. Just a little boring at times, but it's really short, so. Next up, I read Happy Hour by Marlo Granados. Not very plot-centered, but we follow these two young women as they move to the city for the summer, and it's written in diary entries, and we're from the perspective of one of the girls, and we see kind of her life in the city, the relationships she builds, her relationship with her friend that she moved with, and kind of their experience over the summer. And there's not a lot of plot, as I said, but it's really about the atmosphere and it's about the characters. This book was very much about the vibes, and it was very well done. It has this energy throughout that's very frantic, and you're moving from scene to scene. There are lots of little vignettes, and it's good. The writing was nice. The characters were interesting. Even though there wasn't a lot of plot, the plot that we did get was still interesting, and it was a fast read too. It's not that long. So I'd highly recommend. I think I gave this a 4-star. Next up is another book I had to read for school, The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, obviously by Frederick Douglass. This is a memoir by Frederick Douglass about his life during slavery and how he escaped from slavery, obviously nonfiction, and when he was writing this, his purpose was to kind of reveal the evils and the cruelty and the hypocrisy ingrained in the American institution of slavery, and also by using moments in his life. It's incredibly tough to read, but it's very important to read first-person accounts like this because it gives humanity behind facts and figures. It talks a lot about religion, the role of religion in slavery, and how that was like used by enslavers as justification for their actions. It talks about the importance of education, the importance of knowledge as a form of freedom. Frederick Douglass is known as someone who taught himself how to read and write, and he talks about that a lot in the book and how important that was. Also not going to rate it because I don't feel like it's something I should rate, but 100% would give it 5 stars. Next, I read a short story collection called Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. This is a speculative fiction short story collection, translated work, and overall really enjoyed it as well. Some of the stories were obviously better than others, but that's any short story collection. You're gonna have some you like more, some you like less. So I guess I'll just talk about some of my favorites. The first story in this book is called The Head. A really good opening because it has a lot of shock value. It's not just about the shock value. I don't want to give anything away if you haven't read it, but it's a pretty disgusting story, and it really sets the tone for a lot of the book. And we follow this woman as she discovers a monster, and I'll leave it at that. Another one I really liked in this one was Goodbye, My Love. It's a story about androids, and it's pretty dark fiction of humans could interact with androids in the future, what that could lead to, relationships that could be built, and how that could kind of fall apart, and just really interestingly told, and I liked it a lot. I think all the stories in this collection are very interestingly told, and they're very unique and creative and like nothing I've ever read before. So once again, highly recommend this collection. I gave it 4 stars as well. Next, I read The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, and this book takes place in India. It takes place kind of in 2 timelines. We have the present, where these 2 twins are reuniting after having been separated for a long time, and they're coming back to their childhood house. The only person who's left who's alive is their great aunt, I'm pretty sure. It's an older member of their family. Flashbacks get the context behind how decades ago everything in their family fell apart, and it's based on this incident with another family member who comes to visit a distant relative, and this takes place when the twins were kids and when this family member was also a kid. The relationship between the family, the relationships with the community, it explores this community and the town that this all takes place in very well, the political climate in their area at the time. Overall, the story examines class and caste systems and how police interfere in things that they shouldn't. Really good. It's a bit of a slower book, but the writing is beautiful. The ending is incredible, and even if it's a slower start, the ending makes up for it, and it's 100% worth it. I also gave this 4 stars. Next, I have another non-fiction, The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. She's really known for a lot of her fiction work, but also her non-fiction that kind of talks about her life in California. And I've read a lot of her fiction in the past, but this was my first non-fiction work by her, and it's a memoir that chronicles a year in her life right after her husband died. Her daughter is very sick. Talks a lot about that experience over the course of that whole year, and she talks about the grieving process and explores this idea of magical thinking and how after you lose so much, you kind of go into a certain state. For example, like believing that he would come back in the form of not wanting to throw out his shoes, because what if he needed his shoes when he came back, and stuff like that. So she talks a lot about grief, a lot about how people react with grief, how she reacted to grief, and it's painful. She doesn't hold back from anything, and just incredible writing, incredible insights, and I had to give it 5 stars. Just really good. Would recommend. Next, I read The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy. It takes place in Russia. It has a lot of historical influence. And this is another fantasy that's very fairy tale oriented. It has a very whimsical feel. Most of the magical elements are about little like creatures, demons, but they're not really demons. Kind of based on, I'm pretty sure, Russian folklore. The story kind of starts with this girl, her family. They're nobles, but they live in a more remote area. Her mother died for her to be born, and the story goes that her mother's mother was this kind of magical witch from the forest who came and seduced the king of Russia at the time, and this magic apparently runs in their family, and so she wanted to birth a daughter that could carry on that magic, and so she decides to have the main character. And then we fast forward a bunch of years, and we see her father goes to the nobles and goes to look for a new wife. The story follows the new wife in the new area, and also a priest that comes along as well, and the conflict between the old and the new. We see a lot of explorations of Christianity versus these kind of Russian inspired creatures that she wants to protect. And it's a very whimsical story. It really feels like a fairy tale. It's very atmospheric. It was really good to read in the winter, I will say, because it's a very cold book about the forest and how cold it is in the forest and all the creatures in the forest, and it just was the perfect book to read in winter. And just atmospheric, whimsical, really fun. So I also gave it 4 stars. The last thing I read is The Aleph and Other Stories by Jorge Luis Borges. This is a short story collection. It's an old short story collection, speculative. This is classic. He's many people's favorite authors. And this is not very long, but there's a lot of stories. There are a lot packed in there, and most of the stories are very short. And personally, I had a lot of trouble getting into some of them. The writing style didn't necessarily appeal to me, but it wasn't that it was bad. Like, the writing is incredible. It just, like, it feels very personal in a way. It feels like you're being talked to by the author, and like he's trying to like share the story as if it's true, and that's true in a lot of older books, but still, it's like this kind of style that I didn't necessarily love, but I think a lot of the stories are very innovative. They're very creative, and some of them are really, really, really good. It's just they weren't all my favorites. Talk a little bit about some of my favorites. One of my favorites is called The Circular Ruins, and we follow this man who kind of washes up on the shore, and he's dreaming, and he's trying to create a person by dreaming, and that's all I'll say, because I don't want to spoil it, but that one, the ending, just very insane, trippy, is the only way I could put it. Another favorite was Ibn Hakan al-Bakari, Dead in His Labyrinth, long title, but it's about murder, it's about betrayal, all those good things. Very fun, pretty dark, but that one was also very good. So those were my favorites in the collection, but overall I did enjoy quite a bit of it, but I just had some drawbacks with the writing, and not all of the stories were that engaging. Okay, so that's gonna do it. Those are all the books I read this January. Here's a stack. The rest were all on Kindle. Overall, just happy I read a lot this month. I don't know how much time I'm gonna have this coming month to read, but at least I got to a good start in January, and I read a lot of good books, nothing below a 3-star, so just a really good month, and I hope this will continue in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe if you want, comment if you want, tell me what was the favorite book that you read in January, what do you think of any of the books I talked about in this video, and I'll see you next time.